The movie Grand Canyon, set in the Los Angeles of the early 90s, begins with an attorney named Mac. He's enjoying an LA Lakers game with his best friend, and he leaves the arena at the end of the game and takes a wrong turn into the bad part of town where his car conveniently breaks down, or inconveniently. Mac then faces a number of muggers and is rescued at the last moment by the tow truck driver who's coming to pick up his car. Simon, the truck driver, is able to talk the muggers out of robbing Mac. There is a moment when one of the muggers is pointing a gun at Simon's head, and Simon just asks the mugger to let him do his job. The mugger wonders why Simon is being so calm around him. And Simon responds, "Man, the world ain't supposed to work like this. I mean, maybe you don't know that yet. I'm supposed to be able to do my job without having to ask you if I can. And that dude is supposed to be able to wait with his car without you ripping him off. Everything is supposed to be different than it is. The world ain't supposed to work like this." It's a feeling that all of us have had at some point in our lives. On Friday, a colleague posted on Facebook the question, "What do you remember about 9/11?" Within moments, many had chimed in about what they were doing, how surreal it was. Some talked about going through the motions of their day, but with a strange sort of detachment. I remember I was getting ready to go to work. I'd picked up Mackenzie in her diaper bag. I was walking out through the family room on the way to the garage. I picked up the remote to flip off the TV downstairs when it caught my eye, that building on fire. I paused for a moment while it began to sink in that this was live TV and not some Bruce Willis movie. The second plane hit while I stood there, and I picked up my phone to call the sitter and telling her, "Turn on your TV. There's something going on here." And then I was going to stay at home until I knew more what was happening. I remember sinking to the floor and having this strange time where I was playing with and distracting Mackenzie, even as I was transfixed by all the horror that was unfolding that morning. We probably each have that same kind of story, if we're old enough, and others too, places in our lives where something in the larger world narrative struck us so strongly that it etched the moment in our memory. For instance, I can tell you that I was in a Kennedy driver's ed class with Harvey Hopp when the Challenger exploded. And I was in the library at Kenwood Elementary when Reagan was shot. I've heard stories told about people's experiences when Kennedy was assassinated, them remembering the details as if it were yesterday, or exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And then there are the stories that are more regional. I have some pretty clear memories of the flood of '08. That constant rain and the slow, impending, unstoppable march of floodwaters. And all of us gathered right here have a story about August 10th and the days following. Maybe that's a story that's still unfolding for us. The world ain't supposed to work like this. 2020 has been a heavy year, filled both with the unraveling in our natural world in the form of wildfires and derechos, drought and hurricane, and with the violence and anger and hatred and vitriol as we relate to one another and turn on one another, and we're not done with it yet. I think we all agree with the sentiment. The world ain't supposed to work like this. This year I will be following the narrative lectionary in my preaching and will be using the same stories in the faith education of our youngest members. The narrative lectionary is a set of suggested readings that starts with Genesis and goes through the Gospels, Luke this year, and Acts, and will all end together around in Galatians in May. Now, sometimes as a congregation, we have a haphazard experience of the Bible, a passage here, a story there, a series on this or that. So from time to time, it's a really good idea to step back and take a broad view. For as Christians, we have not only our own story individually and the larger world story which it intersects, we have God's story found in Scripture, and it is a story that bends us towards reconciliation and hope. And as we think about God's story and overlay it on our own narrative, it can give us insight into our own story and help us find our own hope, even during dark or difficult times. The world ain't supposed to work like this. The book of Genesis sets the stage with that statement on its mind. I wonder sometimes about what events happened in the lives of humans long ago, thousands of years before now, warming themselves by a fire against the night chill. What tragedy befell them that they were sitting there trying to make sense of it as they considered their life, their place in the larger order of things? What spirit sent from God rested upon them to imagine that something might be different, might be better than the now that they were experiencing? We begin with the beautifully liturgical account of God's good creation in chapter 1, but the early writers and storytellers did not stop there. They superimposed the second account upon the first, a story that tries to grapple with the reality of living in a world with such capacity for evil on the one hand, yet such good on the other. The story in the Garden of Eden tries to explain how things got so broken. Now, sometimes I think we imagine the fruit of the tree of knowledge as some sort of magic, that Adam and Eve's eyes were opened and they recognized the evil that was already there. But in some ways, just the fact that they had been told not to eat, and then they go ahead and do it anyway, it's not the fruit that does anything, but this action of disobedience that begins to break the relationship between themselves and God. Before that moment, there was only good for Adam and Eve to know, but the choice to disobey, to choose a different path than God's path, suddenly evil becomes a product that can be known. It comes down to an issue of choice. Some theologians suggest that made in the image of God means that we are made with the ability to choose to rationally or irrationally pick a path to follow. But we are not God, so the very thing that heralds us as sentient human beings, the very thing that makes us independent actors on our own behalf, the very thing that allows us to develop our sense of self and then enter into mutual relationships with others and with God, choice, the very thing that gives us so much of what it means to be human, is also the very thing that trips us up. For you see, the story is not just about a once and for all event involving an apple at the beginning of time, an original sin, as it were. It is a story to help us understand that each day brings opportunities in which people make choices, decisions. Some are for the good, and sadly, some are not. Years ago, a choice was made by terrorists to hijack planes and take as many people with them as they could to their death. But also choices were made by strangers to face certain death themselves, to fight back and save potential innocent victims on the ground. Choices were made by emergency personnel and regular citizens to rush towards burning and falling buildings to help others evacuate. Choices were made to stop or slow down and help evacuate people in wheelchairs or with other mobility issues or injuries, some physically being carried to safety by strangers who were risking their own lives. Genesis begins not so much as a prescription for life, but as a description of our human experience, that reality we experience every day, this tension that we hold within our very selves, this mix of earth and God's own breath, this tension that the very heights of our potential are sometimes matched by the depths of our depravity. But yet there is hope. The story of humanity begins in a hard place, a place of fear and hiding, of disobedience and blaming and shame. Adam and Eve will be ejected from the garden. They can't go back. We can't go back. But neither does God. God does not distance God's self from us. God does not lock us out of Eden and remain behind to enjoy the garden. Contact with the divine is not cut off behind closed doors or fiery swords. No, God follows us out of the garden. We are only 3 chapters in, and the rest of the words and sentences and chapters and books of our scripture all will tell the story of how God pursued us despite our choices, never giving up, even unto the cross. We often wonder about a God who could allow people to freely sin, often with horrific consequences. But if God restrained us and forced us to only do what is right, in the process, God would restrict who we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the most amazing thing about God is not that God can cause perfection to happen, but that God can totally and without restraint love each of us with all of our imperfections. Oddly, a perfect and sin-free world would be perfect, but unimaginably sterile, and the power of love would seem so small. But the fragile world in which we live and all the bad choices we might make in spite of God's guidance to do otherwise allow us to see how far God will go to love us in spite of what we seem to deserve. God will spend the rest of the world's time offering forgiveness and love, bending us constantly, this arc of the story, towards hope, transforming our beginning into God's own ending, working towards a time when everything is supposed to be exactly as it is. And that is good news indeed. Amen.